Teams racing through the woods in the middle of the night. Dangerous rescues hanging from ropes along the side of cliffs. That stuff does happen, but not as nearly as often as people think. Most of the job is less exciting. A hiker twists an ankle 3 miles from the nearest road. An elderly man with dementia wanders away from his property. A hunter loses his bearings after dark and spends the night walking in circles. These are the calls we get most often. The good news is that we usually find those people. Sometimes they're embarrassed or cold or injured, but most of the time they go home. Now, the mountains can be dangerous, but they aren't trying to kill anyone. At least that's what I believed when I first started. Back then, I was 24 years old and convinced I had one of the best jobs in the world. I grew up in Appalachia. The mountains never scared me. I spent my childhood hiking trails, fishing creeks, exploring old logging roads, and getting into places my parents would have killed me for visiting. By the time I joined search and rescue, I felt like I knew those mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. And I quickly learned I was wrong. Appalachia, it's huge. Most people don't realize just how large it is until they see it for themselves. The mountain range stretches across multiple states. Thousands of square miles of forest cover the region. There are valleys that haven't changed much in 100 years. There are abandoned mines, forgotten homesteads, old cemeteries, and cave systems that go deeper underground than most people would ever willingly follow. You can spend your entire life here and still discover places you have never seen before. That's one of the reasons people disappear. The mountains don't have to do anything strange. All it takes is one wrong turn, one bad decision, one storm arriving earlier than expected, one missed trail marker. After that, things can go downhill very quickly. Over the years, I've searched for hundreds of people, and some cases lasted an hour, weeks, a few lasted months. Most of them had normal explanations. A person got lost or injured or panicked. Case closed. But every once in a while, we'd come across something that didn't fit neatly into a report. Something that made experienced people stop talking for a moment. Something that stayed with you long after the search ended. I'm not talking about monsters or ghosts, and I'm definitely not talking about internet stories. The 5 cases I'm about to tell you all came from actual searches I worked during my career. Now, before anyone starts drawing conclusions, I'm not claiming I know what happened in any of them. I don't. In every story, there are details that could probably be explained if someone had enough information. The problem is that we never found enough information. That's what makes these cases different. Most search and rescue operations end with answers. These didn't. Some ended with evidence that made no sense. Some ended with witnesses who all reported the same thing. Some ended with discoveries that still bother me years later. I still have copies of the reports. I still remember the names. And in a few cases, I still remember exactly where I was standing when things stopped making sense. The first story, it happened about 12 years ago, started with a missing couple. At the time, nobody thought it was going to be unusual. The boyfriend and girlfriend had gone hiking near a remote cave system that sat several miles from the nearest road. When they didn't come home, their families reported them missing. Search teams were assembled, maps were checked, volunteers arrived. Everything about the situation looked routine, at least in the beginning. Then we found the blood, and from that point forward, the search became something none of us ever forgot. The first story happened in October of 2014. At the time, I was working with a search and rescue unit based in eastern Tennessee. The area we covered included several state parks, large sections of national forest, and dozens of cave systems scattered throughout the mountains. Most of the caves were harmless if people stayed near the entrances. The problem was that people rarely did. Every year we'd get calls from hikers who wanted to explore somewhere they'd seen online or heard about from a friend. Most of them had no equipment, no maps, and no experience underground. Usually we found them. Sometimes we had to drag them out. And a few times we recovered bodies. That's why nobody thought much about the call when it first came in. A young couple had gone hiking near an old cave system known locally as Black Hollow Cave. The boyfriend was named Tyler Morgan. The girlfriend was named Emily Davis. Both were in their early 20s. According to their families, They'd planned a day hike and were supposed to be back before dark. When neither of them answered their phones that evening, relatives assumed they'd lost signal. The following morning, nobody had heard from them, and that's when the search started. I arrived at the command post shortly after sunrise. The weather was clear, visibility was good. We had volunteers, deputies, and 2 search dogs working the area. The couple's vehicle was found exactly where their family said it would be. A small trailhead parking lot roughly 3 miles from the cave entrance. Nothing looked unusual, no signs of foul play, no damaged vehicle, no indication they'd met anyone. Just an empty parking space surrounded by trees. Well, the first few hours went exactly as expected. Several teams searched the main trails, another group checked the cave entrance, a third team began working the surrounding ridges. Around noon, one of the volunteers located a water bottle. About 20 minutes later, another volunteer found a light jacket. Both items were identified by the family. And at that point, we knew we were in the right area. The items formed a rough path leading toward Black Hollow Cave. That wasn't surprising. The cave was the main attraction in that part of the forest. Most missing hikers eventually ended up there. My team reached the cave entrance around 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't especially large, maybe 20 feet wide. The opening sat at the base of a limestone ridge, partially covered by moss and brush. A cool draft flowed out continuously, strong enough to feel from several yards away. Several members of our team entered the cave while others searched outside, and nothing was found. No backpacks or clothing, no footprints we could identify. No signs that anyone had gone deeper into the system. As the afternoon continued, our search area expanded. Around 4 o'clock, Anthony, Norton, and I were assigned to search a narrow ridge running south of the cave. The terrain there was rough, loose rocks and dense trees, steep drop-offs. Not a place where people usually wandered unless they got lost. Well, we spent an hour moving through the area without finding anything. Then Anthony stopped. "Randy," he said. I walked over. He was pointing toward a rock about 10 feet away. At first I didn't see it, and then I noticed a dark stain. Blood. Not much, just a few drops. We marked the location and continued forward. About 20 yards later, we found more. Then more. The blood trail wasn't heavy. It looked more like someone walking while injured. A few drops here, a few drops there. Enough to follow. Not enough to explain. The discovery immediately changed the mood of the search. Lost hikers are one thing, injured hikers are another. Now everyone was moving faster. Additional personnel were sent to our position. The blood trail continued along the ridge for nearly half a mile. Sometimes it disappeared, then it would reappear farther ahead. Every time we thought we'd lost it, another drop would show up on a rock or patch of leaves. The trail eventually led us toward an area none of us expected. A cliff. The ridge ended abruptly. Beyond it was a steep ravine dropping several hundred feet. The view below was mostly trees, large boulders, and thick brush. Anthony was the first to reach the edge. I arrived a few seconds later. The last blood drops were sitting on a flat section of rock less than 3 feet from the drop. We searched the immediate area carefully. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, nothing. Just blood, then open air. I remember standing there staring over the edge, trying to make sense of it. If someone had fallen, there should have been evidence below. Broken limbs, damaged brush, something. Instead, everything looked completely untouched. Additional teams arrived shortly afterward. Ropes were brought in. Personnel descended into the ravine. Drones were deployed. The entire area below the cliff was searched before sunset. And nothing, no bodies or clothing, no backpacks, no signs that anybody had ever been there. The blood samples were collected and later confirmed to belong to one of the missing hikers, and that only made things stranger. We knew at least one of them had been injured. We knew the blood trail was real and it ended at the cliff. What we didn't know was where either person had gone. The search continued for 6 more days. More volunteers arrived, additional dogs were brought in, helicopters searched the surrounding forest. Nearby caves were checked again. Every possible route was examined, and nothing. No additional evidence was ever located. The couple's phones were never found, no backpacks, no bodies ever found. It was like they'd simply vanished. The official investigation remained open for years. Various theories were discussed. Maybe they became lost and wandered farther than expected. Maybe the blood trail belonged to an unrelated injury. Maybe somebody removed evidence before search teams arrived. Every explanation had problems. The biggest problem was the cliff. I still think about that location. I've returned there several times over the years. Not as part of a search, but I don't know why exactly. Every time I stand on that ridge, I find myself looking over the edge again, trying to see something I missed, trying to find a detail that would finally make the whole thing fit together, but never does. What especially bothers me is the blood trail, because blood trails are supposed to lead somewhere, to a body or campsite, an injured person, evidence, to answers. This one led to a cliff, and then it simply stopped. 12 years later, Tyler Morgan and Emily Davis remain missing. No bodies have ever been recovered, no suspects were ever identified, and no explanation has ever fully accounted for what we found on that ridge. Out of all the searches I've worked, I think this is the one I revisit the most. I still don't know what happened after those last few drops of blood reached the edge of that cliff. The second story took place during the summer of 2018. At first, nobody connected the incidents. The reports came from different areas of the county and were spread out over nearly 2 weeks. Individually, none of them sounded especially unusual. Farmers occasionally found dead livestock. Deer sometimes died from disease or injury. People reported seeing strange animals in the mountains all the time. Most of those reports turned out to be nothing. This one didn't. The first call came from a property owner who lived near a cave system, about 20 miles north of where I was stationed. He discovered 2 dead goats early one morning while checking his fencing. Predators weren't unusual in that area. Black bears, coyotes, bobcats, and wild dogs all occasionally caused problems for livestock owners. Normally, when one of those animals attacked, the evidence was obvious. There'd be signs of a struggle, tracks, torn fencing, blood scattered throughout the area. The goats in this case looked different. Neither animal had been eaten. Neither animal appeared to have been dragged. Both were simply lying on the ground near a tree line. The property owner noticed 2 puncture wounds on the neck of each goat. That detail made enough people curious that photographs were taken. A wildlife officer examined the scene and initially suspected some kind of animal attack, but he couldn't identify what animal might have been responsible. The wounds were unusual. Not impossible, just unusual. The case likely would have ended there if similar reports hadn't started appearing over the following days. 3 days later, a hunter discovered a dead deer less than 5 miles away. The deer showed similar injuries. Again, there was surprisingly little blood present. There were puncture wounds, and again, nobody could confidently identify what had happened. By the end of the week, several more animals had been found dead. Most were deer. One was a large wild hog. Another was a calf from a nearby farm. And that was when local rumors started spreading. People always talk, especially in small mountain communities. Some blamed coyotes, others blamed disease. A few started suggesting something much stranger. They claimed large bats had been seen flying near one of the cave systems in the area. Normally that would have been ignored. The problem was that the reports weren't coming from a single witness. They were coming from multiple people who didn't know each other. One witness claimed he saw several large shapes leaving the cave shortly after sunset. Another described seeing something circle above a pasture before disappearing toward the mountains. A third reported hearing unusual screeching sounds near the cave entrance during the evening. None of those reports proved anything. Witnesses make mistakes. People can exaggerate. Distance and darkness can make ordinary things look unusual. Still, enough reports accumulated that our department eventually became involved. Now, the cave itself sat in a remote section of forest accessible only by a rough dirt road. The entrance was considerably larger than most caves in the area, roughly 30 feet wide and extending downward into a network of tunnels that had never been fully mapped. Several agencies coordinated a survey of the area. I was part of one of the teams assigned to assist. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was the smell. It was strange. The area around the entrance contained a strong animal odor that seemed far more concentrated than it should have been. Several piles of animal droppings were located near the opening. Wildlife activity clearly existed around the cave. Whether it had any connection to the reports was another matter. We spent most of the day documenting the area. Tracks were photographed, animal remains were collected. The cave interior was explored as far as safety allowed. Nothing definitive was found. No giant bats, no unknown animals, no evidence that anything extraordinary lived there. Still, some details bothered people. Several deer carcasses were located within a few hundred yards of the cave entrance. Again, many showed puncture wounds similar to those reported elsewhere. Wildlife specialists examined them and offered possible explanations, but nobody seemed completely satisfied. The timing also continued to attract attention. Most of the sightings were occurring at night. Many happened near the same cave. And several occurred during the days leading up to a full moon. That last detail probably means nothing. I want to be clear about that. People love connecting unusual events to full moons. Most of the time it's coincidence. Still, it was something witnesses repeatedly brought up when giving statements. The night of the full moon ended up producing the most reports. Our team wasn't conducting an active search that evening, but several of us were still in the area assisting with documentation and follow-up interviews. Around dusk, 2 local residents contacted authorities, claiming they'd seen large flying animals near the ridge above the cave. Their descriptions weren't identical, but they were similar enough to get attention. Both estimated wingspans significantly larger than any bats normally found in the region. Neither witness could provide photographs. Neither witness claimed to have seen details clearly. What they reported were silhouettes, large dark shapes crossing in front of the moon. And that was it. Nothing conclusive. Just enough to keep the rumors alive. Over the next several days, additional dead wildlife continued appearing throughout the area. Then, almost as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. No more sightings or reports, no more unexplained animal deaths. The cave remained where it had always been, and the forest returned to normal. Life moved on. Most people eventually forgot about the entire thing. I probably would have as well, if not for something I personally witnessed near the end of the investigation. A few days before the report stopped, I was part of a small team conducting a final evening survey near the cave entrance. There were 3 of us. We weren't expecting to find anything. The investigation had already reached a point where everyone assumed there would never be a definitive answer. We were simply documenting the area one last time before scaling operations back. The sun had already dropped behind the mountains. The forest was beginning to darken. Visibility wasn't great, but wasn't completely dark either. I remember standing near a rocky overlook above the cave entrance when one of the other team members pointed toward the valley below. At first, I couldn't see what we were looking at, and then I noticed movement. Several dark shapes were crossing above the tree line. The distance made identification difficult, very difficult. Whatever they were, they appeared larger than most birds. Their flight pattern looked unusual. For maybe 10 seconds, all 3 of us watched them move across the valley, and then they disappeared behind a ridge. And that was it. No attack, no monster emerging from a cave. Just a brief observation that none of us could confidently explain. Now, could they have been birds? Absolutely. Could distance and lighting have distorted what we were seeing? Without question. Could there be a perfectly normal explanation for everything that happened that summer? Probably. In fact, that's still the explanation I lean toward. But what I do find interesting is that nobody ever managed to provide that explanation. The animal deaths remained unexplained. The bite marks remained unusual. The witness reports remained consistent enough to be difficult to dismiss completely. And the cave continued generating stories long after the investigation ended. Even today, local residents occasionally bring it up. Most laugh about it. Some don't. As for me, I don't know. I also don't think every witness simply imagined what they saw. Unfortunately, with whatever the truth was, it disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. The sighting stopped, the animal death stopped, the investigation ended, and the mountains kept their answer. So in this third story, nobody disappeared, nobody died or got injured. In fact, if you heard the story from certain people, you'd probably dismiss it immediately and move on with your day. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you. If somebody had told me this story before I saw part of it for myself, I probably would have done the same thing. The reason it stayed with me isn't because I think something supernatural happened. I don't know. It's because I still don't have a good explanation for what multiple groups of people reported seeing over the course of nearly 3 weeks. The incident took place during the winter of 2021. The area involved was a large section of mountain forest that sat roughly 15 miles from the nearest town. The section contained several hiking trails, a few seasonal campsites, and enough wildlife that search and rescue teams were frequently called out to assist lost hunters or stranded hikers. The first report came from a pair of campers. At the time, nobody paid much attention to it. The two men claimed they'd seen a pack of wolves moving along a ridgeline shortly after sunset. And that wasn't strange. While wolves aren't common throughout much of Appalachia, occasional sightings are reported, and large wild dogs or coyotes are frequently mistaken for wolves from a distance. The unusual part wasn't the animals themselves. It was the description. Both men insisted the wolves appeared to be glowing. They described it as a faint blue-green sheen that seemed visible along portions of the animal's fur whenever the moonlight hit them. The report was written down, a few jokes were made, and everybody moved on. And about 4 days later, another report came in. This time it came from a married couple who had been driving along a mountain road after dark. Neither knew the original witnesses, neither had any reason to make up the story. Their description, though, was remarkably similar. They reported seeing several wolf-like animals standing near the tree line overlooking a field. Again, the witnesses described a strange glow. Again, they specifically mentioned a bluish color, and they struggled to explain exactly what they'd seen. At that point, the reports became interesting. Not because they proved anything, but because independent witnesses were describing similar details. A week later, a group of hunters submitted another report. Then another family. Then a hiker. The descriptions varied slightly from person to person, but several details remained consistent. The animals always appeared in groups. Most witnesses estimated between 5 and 8 wolves. The sightings generally occurred around dusk or shortly after dark, and nearly everyone described the same unusual coloration: blue, green, silver. The exact shade changed depending on the witness. The basic description remained surprisingly consistent. Now, at first, most of us assumed there was a straightforward explanation. Moonlight can create strange effects, fog can distort visibility, animal eyes often reflect light in unusual ways, distance can make almost anything look different than it actually is. All of those explanations seemed reasonable. The problem was the reports kept coming. Eventually, enough people had reported seeing the animals that our department became involved. Not because we thought glowing wolves were roaming the mountains, but because any large predator sightings near hiking areas tend to attract attention. One afternoon, I was assigned to investigate several of the locations where witnesses claimed the animals had been seen. Sarah Williams came with me. At the time, Sarah had already spent nearly a decade working in search and rescue, and was one of the more experienced people on our team. Like me, she wasn't especially impressed by the stories. We spent most of the day checking trails, interviewing witnesses, and documenting locations. Nothing stood out. No unusual tracks, no unusual animal remains. No evidence that anything extraordinary was taking place. By late afternoon, we'd essentially concluded that the sightings were probably being exaggerated through repetition. And then the sun started going down. We were driving along a Forest Service road near one of the more recent sighting locations when Sarah suddenly pointed toward a distant ridge. "Do you see that?" I looked where she was pointing. At first I didn't, and then I noticed movement. Several animals were crossing the ridge line approximately half a mile away. And even from that distance, the size was obvious. They were considerably larger than coyotes. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, it's difficult to say exactly. We pulled over and watched. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The wolves weren't running. They weren't hunting. They were simply moving along the ridgeline from east to west. And then I saw something happen whenever they crossed patches of open ground. The moon had already risen above the mountains, its light reflected across portions of their bodies. And for brief moments, the fur appeared almost luminous. Not glowing, that's still not the word I'd use, but there was definitely something unusual about the way the light interacted with them. The effect reminded me of certain fish scales or bird feathers that appear to change color depending on the angle. The animals would move through shadow, then moonlight would hit them. And for a second or two, portions of their fur would appear silver blue. Then the effect would vanish again. We watched the pack for perhaps a minute before they disappeared into the trees. And that was the entirety of the encounter. Just a distant observation that happened to match many of the previous witness reports. Afterward, Sarah and I spent quite a bit of time discussing possible explanations. Neither of us believed the wolves were literally glowing. The more likely explanation involved moonlight, winter conditions, and some unusual characteristic of the animals' coats. Certain species display surprisingly strange reflective properties under specific lighting conditions. And that explanation made sense. The problem was that nobody could ever confirm it. Wildlife officials never managed to identify the specific animals involved. Photographs were attempted but never produced anything unusual. Several blurry images circulated online, maybe you've seen them, but none were clear enough to prove anything. And within a few weeks, the sightings stopped. Just like that. The wolves simply disappeared from public attention. Maybe they moved to another area. Maybe witness interest faded. Maybe people stopped reporting what they saw. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that at least 3 separate groups of witnesses reported seeing nearly identical details before those reports became widely known. And then Sarah Williams and I observed something that appeared remarkably similar ourselves. Could there be a perfectly ordinary explanation? Absolutely. In fact, that's what I still believe. But every mystery doesn't need a monster to be interesting. Sometimes a mystery is simply a collection of observations that never quite fit together neatly enough to produce a final answer. The glowing wolves were one of those mysteries. Nobody was ever harmed, nothing dangerous ever occurred. The animals never approached people, they never attacked livestock, they never behaved aggressively. They simply appeared for a few weeks during one winter, walked across a handful of ridgelines under the moonlight, and then vanished back into the Appalachian forest. The 4th story happened during a search that honestly wasn't particularly unusual, at least not at first. An elderly man in his 70s had gone missing after leaving a campground near the state line. He wasn't suffering from dementia or any known medical condition. According to his family, he simply enjoyed hiking and often spent time exploring the woods on his own. The problem was that he failed to return when he said he would. After about 24 hours without contact, a search operation was organized. By that point, I'd been working search and rescue for well over a decade, and I'd participated in enough missing persons cases to know that the first day is usually the most important. If someone is lost, injured, or unable to move, every hour matters. Well, we spent the entire morning searching trails, old logging roads, creek beds, and several ridges near the campground. Nothing. No signs that the missing man had passed through the area. By late afternoon, several search teams had begun expanding farther into the surrounding forest. I was assigned to work a section of terrain roughly 2 miles from the campground, along with another volunteer named Gordon Bryant. The area was heavily wooded and relatively steep, with large rock formations scattered throughout the hillside. Most of our time was spent moving slowly through the trees while looking for anything that seemed out of place. The search continued that way for several hours, and then just before sunset, I heard something. At first I thought it was another search team using a portable radio. The sound was faint, so faint that I almost ignored it. But after a few moments, I realized it wasn't coming from a modern radio at all. It sounded like an actual broadcast. Music, voices, static. The sort of thing you would expect from an old AM radio station. I stopped walking and listened. Gordon heard it too. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded. The sounds seemed to be coming from farther down the slope. We assumed someone had left a radio in the woods, maybe a hunter or a camper. Either way, we headed toward it. The signal became stronger as we approached. The strange thing wasn't the radio itself. It was what it was playing. At first I couldn't place it, and then I started recognizing certain details. The music, the advertisements, the voices. Something about it felt very familiar. We eventually found the source sitting beside a fallen tree, and it was an old portable radio, the kind people used decades ago. The casing was scratched and weathered, but it appeared mostly intact. The speaker was still working. The broadcast was coming through clearly. I picked the radio up and listened, and that's when I started getting a strange feeling, because I recognized what I was hearing. I was born in the early 1980s. When I was growing up, my father listened to talk radio constantly. Every evening it seemed like there was some old radio show playing somewhere in the house, whether I wanted to hear it or not. As I stood there in the woods, I realized I was listening to one of those same programs. Not a modern replay or a podcast, the actual broadcast. Or at least what sounded like the actual broadcast. The advertisements were from the 1990s, the news stories from then, the sports scores being discussed were from the 1990s. Everything sounded exactly like something that would have been airing when I was a kid. I remember looking at Gordon and laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was weird. Really weird. And he agreed. For several minutes, we just stood there listening. The hosts were discussing current events as though they were happening in real time. The advertisements referenced products and businesses that either no longer existed or hadn't used those commercials in decades. It sounded like somebody had somehow tuned into the past. Obviously, that wasn't possible. Still, it was difficult to ignore how strange it felt. Well, eventually we resumed searching. I carried the radio with me while we continued working our assigned area. The broadcast never stopped. The signal remained surprisingly clear. Several times, I adjusted the tuning dial to see if I could identify a station. Nothing happened. The program continued exactly as before, no matter where the dial was positioned. I couldn't explain that. As darkness approached, our team received instructions to return to the command post. The missing man still hadn't been found. Gordon and I began making our way back through the forest. The radio continued playing the entire time. Music, commercials, talk shows, everything sounding like it comes straight out of the 90s. I remember hearing an advertisement that I hadn't heard since high school, an ad I was completely certain had disappeared decades ago. By the time we reached the command post, it was fully dark. Vehicles were parked throughout a clearing near the road. Generators were running. Search coordinators were updating maps. The operation looked exactly as it had all day. Nothing unusual or mysterious. I stepped into the edge of the clearing, and the radio immediately died. Not faded or crackled or weakened, it just stopped. 1 second it was broadcasting, the next second there was silence. The radio never produced another sound. Not that night, not the following day, not ever. We eventually brought it back to headquarters and examined it more closely. And nobody found anything remarkable. No hidden recording device, no obvious explanation. just an old radio that no longer worked. As for the missing man, well, we eventually located him 2 days later. He'd suffered a minor injury and become stranded in a remote section of forest. Fortunately, he survived. The search ended successfully. The radio didn't. To this day, I still don't know what was happening out there. Maybe it'd been some kind of pre-recorded audio. Maybe there was a technical explanation I simply didn't understand. Maybe there was a station somewhere rebroadcasting old programs. All of those explanations sound reasonable. What I can't explain is why the radio worked perfectly for hours in the middle of the mountains and then went completely silent the moment I walked back into camp. Maybe it was a coincidence. Honestly, it probably was. But every now and then I still think about that old radio sitting beside that fallen tree, playing voices from 30 years ago in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness. The final story for tonight happened about 6 years ago. And out of everything I've talked about so far, it makes me the most uncomfortable. I've searched abandoned buildings before. Hundreds of them. Old cabins, collapsed barns, mining structures, shacks hidden deep in the woods. Most of them are exactly what you'd expect. Empty, dirty, fallen apart. This place was different. The call came in during early autumn. A 9-year-old boy had gone missing from a campground located near a mountain ridge several miles from the nearest town. According to his parents, he'd wandered away sometime during the afternoon while they were setting up camp. When they realized he was gone, they searched for nearly an hour before contacting authorities. By the time our team arrived, daylight was already beginning to fade. The boy's name was Ethan. He had no history of running away, no medical issues, no reason to intentionally leave the campground. The assumption was that he'd simply wandered off and become lost. Cases like that happen more often than people realize. Children get distracted. They chase animals, they follow trails. Sometimes they don't realize how far they've traveled until it's too late. The initial search focused on the area surrounding the campground. Teams spread out across nearby trails and forest roads. Volunteers searched creek beds and wooded sections surrounding the ridge. For the first several hours, we found absolutely nothing. No footprints or discarded clothing. No signs of where Ethan might have gone. As darkness settled in, we transitioned into a nighttime search operation. Additional personnel arrived. More equipment was brought in. The search continued through the night. Around sunrise the following morning, one of the volunteers discovered something interesting. A small section of disturbed vegetation near an overgrown path. The path wasn't marked on any modern maps. It appeared to be extremely old, possibly an abandoned access road that hadn't been used in decades. The trail climbed toward the highest section of the ridge, and a team was assembled to follow it. I was assigned to that group, along with Linda Harper and Gordon Bryant. The three of us started up the trail shortly after 8 in the morning. The climb took nearly an hour. The higher we went, the stranger the area became. The forest grew thicker. The path became narrower. In several places, fallen trees had partially blocked the route. It honestly didn't seem like somewhere anyone would choose to visit, especially a child. And then we saw the house. It sat near the very top of the ridge, overlooking miles of forest. At one point, it had probably been beautiful. Now it looked abandoned. The structure was old enough that portions of the roof had started sagging inward. Several windows were broken. The paint had almost completely peeled away. What immediately caught my attention wasn't the condition of the building. It was the wind chimes. There were dozens and dozens of them, maybe more. They hung from the porch, from nearby trees, from hooks attached beneath the roof. Some appeared fairly normal, others did not. Several looked homemade, twisted pieces of metal tied together with wire, odd shapes cut from rusted sheets of steel, objects hanging upside down from string. None of them matched, none of them looked decorative. The entire property felt, and I know this sounds crazy, but the entire property felt evil. I know that's a vague description, but it's the best one I can give. I've spent most of my adult life searching isolated places, and something about that house immediately made me very uneasy. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. Linda looked at the structure for several seconds before speaking. "You guys getting a weird feeling from this place?" "Yeah," Gordon replied. I agreed. The house sat completely silent, except for the movement of the wind chimes. No vehicles or smoke, no signs of recent activity. Still, because a child was missing nearby, we had no choice but to investigate. We approached the front door and knocked several times. No answer. Linda called out, "Hello?" Nothing. Gordon walked around one side of the house while I checked the other, and every window I looked through showed the same thing. Dust, old furniture, dark rooms. No people or movement. Eventually, we regrouped near the front entrance. The door wasn't locked, and because of the missing child, we made the decision to enter. The interior looked even older than the outside. Dust covered nearly every surface. Several rooms contained furniture that appeared decades out of date. A grandfather clock stood against one wall. Bookshelves filled with deteriorating books lined another. In some places, it honestly looked as though somebody had simply walked away and never returned. The strange decorations continued throughout the house. Symbols had been carved into portions of the woodwork. Most were simply geometric shapes, circles, lines, patterns. I couldn't identify any of them. To be fair, they may have meant absolutely nothing. People carve strange things into wood all the time. Still, combined with everything else, they added to the atmosphere. We spent nearly 20 minutes searching the structure, and nothing. No sign of Ethan, no indication anybody currently lived there. Eventually, we concluded the house probably had no connection to the disappearance, and we began preparing to leave. And then I noticed movement. At first, I thought I imagined it. Just a brief flicker near one side of the building. I stopped walking and looked back. There it was again. A shape moving behind a dirty window near ground level. A cellar window. I immediately called Linda and Gordon over. All three of us approached the side of the house. The window was partially covered in dirt and grime, but there was definitely something moving inside. For a moment, I thought it might be an animal. And then I saw a face. A child's face. I don't think any of us waited more than a second. We rushed down the cellar entrance and forced the old door open. The basement was dark and smelled strongly of mildew. Flashlights came out immediately. We moved down the stairs, and the room wasn't especially big. Maybe, 20 feet across. Old shelves lined the walls. Boxes sat stacked in corners. And near the back of the room, curled beside a support beam, was Ethan. Alive, scared, and completely confused. Well, the relief all three of us felt in that moment, it's difficult to describe. After nearly a full day of searching, we had finally found him. The strange part came afterward. Once we got him outside and started asking questions, Ethan couldn't explain how he'd gotten there. Not just parts of it, any of it. He remembered being at the campground, walking into the woods. After that, almost nothing. He didn't know how he reached the ridge. He didn't know how he entered the house. He didn't know how long he'd been inside the cellar. According to medical personnel, he was dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise healthy. No evidence suggested anybody had harmed him. No evidence suggested anybody had ever been in the house recently. And that should have been the end of the story. In many ways it was. Ethan was reunited with his family. The search ended successfully, and everyone went home. But the house continued bothering me. Over the following months, I occasionally asked questions about it. Who owned it? Who had lived there? Why had it been abandoned? And the answers were surprisingly difficult to find. Property records existed, but they were incomplete. Ownership appeared to have changed multiple times over the years. Nobody seemed to know much about its history. Nobody seemed particularly interested in preserving it either. Roughly a year later, I learned the county had condemned the structure, and shortly afterward it was demolished. Today there is very little of it left, just fragments of foundation hidden beneath brush and trees. Now maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation for everything. Maybe even wandered inside while lost and simply couldn't remember the details afterward. Children sometimes forget things after stressful events. But even now, years later, I still remember standing in front of that house for the first time. I remember those strange wind chimes hanging from the trees. I remember the carved symbols. I remember the silence. And I remember the feeling I got the moment I stepped through the front door. I've searched a lot of places throughout Appalachia. Most of them feel abandoned. That house didn't. That house felt occupied by something bad. Well, those are some of the strangest cases I've encountered during my years working search and rescue in Appalachia. Looking back on them now, I don't think any of these stories prove anything supernatural. I don't know that there's vampires living in caves, glowing wolves roaming the ridgelines, or radio somehow broadcasting signals from the past. Most of the people I've worked with over the years, they'd probably tell you the same thing. The problem is that having a reasonable explanation and having the correct explanation aren't always the same thing. In search and rescue, our job is usually to find answers. We locate the missing person, we determine where they went, we identify what happened and how it happened. Most cases eventually reach a point where all the pieces fit together. These didn't. A young couple vanished after leaving behind a trail of blood that ended at the edge of a cliff. A series of unexplained animal deaths were linked to sightings nobody could verify. Multiple groups of witnesses reported seeing wolves that appeared almost luminous beneath the moonlight. An old radio played broadcasts from my childhood before going silent forever. And a missing child somehow ended up inside an abandoned house at the top of a mountain ridge without any memory of how he got there. Maybe every one of those stories has a perfectly ordinary explanation. Honestly, I hope they do. I've spent enough time in the mountains to know that nature creates mysteries all by itself. Distance distorts things. Darkness hides details. People misremember events. Fear changes perception, and sometimes a collection of small coincidences can look a lot stranger than it really is. But every once in a while, you come across something that doesn't fit neatly into a report, and no matter how many years pass, you still find yourself thinking about it. And that's what these stories became for me. Not proof, just unexplained questions. The mountains are full of them. Most people think of Appalachia as a place of forests, rivers, trails, and small towns tucked between ridges. And most of the time, that's exactly what it is. Families live here. People work here. Kids grow up here. Life goes on exactly the way it always has. But it's also a place with thousands of square miles of wilderness, countless caves, forgotten roads, abandoned structures, and stretches of forest where a person can walk for hours without seeing another human being. There are places out there that few people ever visit. And there are stories that never receive an explanation.